Hey you, caught in the mood for a pour? I've got another one for our Champagne Widow series, and yes, it is as dramatic as the rest of them. Meet Henriot Brut Souverain, the OG of Reims, stepping onto her stage with the widow's legacy and 2 centuries of Champagne craftsmanship packed into just one bottle. By the end of this episode, you'll be able to score it on grape composition, tasting profile, history, price, and how it fights in its weight class. Welcome to Sip Me Maybe, the podcast where we swirl, sip, and spill the truth about what's in the glass. I'm Julia, and I'm not a sommelier. I'm simply a wine lover with strong opinions and a soft spot for a good pour. I'm passionate about the craft and enjoy digging into it. This is a judgment-free zone, no snobbery, no side-eye. I'll share with you some of my good finds and let you know what I'm tasting. And you're always welcome to share what lights up your palate. Friend to friend, let's take this one from grape to the glass. Today, we are pouring Henriot Brut Souverain, a flagship non-vintage champagne that wears the crest of Reims proudly on its label. I picked this one up at Whole Foods for $56, and we are going to see if it earns a permanent spot in my fridge. Founded in 1808 by Apolline Henriot, a young widow from a family of vignerons and a niece of viticulture pioneer Abbé Godinot. Henriot is one of the oldest champagne houses still run by its founding family. At a time when most women were silent partners, Apolline built her own brand outright, tending vines on the Montagne de Reims and crafting a style that prized lightness, finesse, and clarity decades before it was fashionable. Her access to family vineyards, technical know-how, and trade contacts gave her both the platform and the courage to export her wines abroad. That intuition proved prescient. Early Henriot releases reached beyond local merchants to the courts of Europe. In 1905, Emperor Franz Joseph I granted Henriot an imperial warrant, making it the official supplier to the Habsburg court. This rare endorsement authorized the house to reproduce the imperial arms alongside the Reims city crest on its label, a privilege granted to only a handful of champagne producers, a striking mark of prestige and an undeniable flex. The crest you see today isn't mere ornamentation. It speaks on 2 levels. Geography, firmly anchoring Henriot in Reims, the city of coronations and chalk cellars, where kings were crowned and champagne traditions were refined, and heritage and prestige, evoking the Habsburg warrant and century-old link to aristocratic labels far beyond France. Another quiet but pivotal move came in the late 19th century through marriage alliances. Henriot acquired significant Chardonnay vineyards in Côte du Blanc, notably in Avize and Le Mesnil-sur-Oger, making it one of the first Reims houses to tilt deliberately towards Chardonnay. That shift still defines the blends today, giving them a distinctive, more Chardonnay-driven character than most of its neighbors. Taken together, the symbols and sourcing choices aren't just branding. They're shorthand for Henriot's story, a widow's independent vision, and a rare imperial endorsement, and a deliberate tilt towards the finesse over flash that continues to shape the house's champagne 2 centuries later. Henriot doesn't just buy grapes on the open market and hopes for the best. It draws fruit from a patchwork of Premier and Grand Cru vineyards, Chardonnay from Côte du Blanc, think Avize and Le Mesnil-sur-Oger. For finesse and chalky brightness, Pinot Noir and a touch of Meunier from Montagne de Reims, the backbone and quiet strength. This blend of sides gives their wines that mix of grace and structure the house is known for. Henriot has long-term contracts and relationships with growers. It also owns some of its own vineyards. They make their champagne the traditional way, method champenoise, but with a few deliberate choices that set them apart. The base wines are fermented, blended, and bottled for their second fermentation, just like everyone else. But then Henriot slows things down. Instead of legal minimum 15 months on the lease. For non-vintage champagne, Brut Souverain rests at least 3 years on its lease, and the vintage cuvée even longer, 5 to 6 years. That patience builds depth and fine, creamy, beet without heavy oak. Consistency comes from their reserve wines too. Around 30 to 50% of the blend in Brut Souverain is drawn from older vintages, held back specifically to add complexity and keep the style steady from year to year. It's pretty generous use of reserve wines, designed to keep the style consistent and add extra depth and maturity. Reserve wines bring a touch of honeyed complexity, subtle toastiness, and a longer finish without having to rely solemnly on long aging after bottling. It's a clever shortcut to layering youth and maturity together. And while some houses block malolactic fermentation to keep razor-sharp acidity, and others push it all the way for buttery softness, Henriot takes what's called a partial malolactic fermentation, a middle road between razor-sharp and buttery. Instead of letting every base wine go through the full malolactic fermentation or blocking it entirely, they let only some of lots finish the process or stop it partway. One portion stays crisp and green apple fresh, the other softens into lactic creaminess. And later, two are blended. The result is a champagne that keeps it bright, chalky backbone while gaining just enough roundness to feel polished. Think citrus lift and gentle creaminess, rather than either razor blade or melted butter. Put it simply, every choice here, vineyard sourcing, patient lease aging, generous reserve wines, and measured touch of MLF reflects Henriot's deliberate tilt towards finesse over flash. It's champagne built quietly and carefully, which is exactly why it drinks with such poise. Here's a teeny pour French for you. See, élaboré par at the bottom of the label. It simply means produced by, the legal way of telling you who made the wine. Also, a subtle hint, this champagne was made for French, is always a good gauge when choosing wine. French people are very particular about their food and wine, and the fact that this champagne caters to the French public gives me an extra confidence. In some cases, this rule can be broken. For example, fantastic champagne, Jeeper, a derivative from the car brand name, but that is the whole other story, full of fun surprises. In Henriot's case, it confirms that the house itself crafted the champagne you're about to drink. Combine that with the Reims crest and you've got a bottle whose label is basically a passport of origin and a stamp of quality they're proud of. When you see on the champagne label like Henriot Brut Souverain, the word souverain isn't just a legal category, but rather a cuvées name. Henriot chooses it to signal the flagship non-vintage blend, the souverain expression of the house style. So you can read it as Brut Souverain, the house sovereign or signature dry champagne. Brut Souverain isn't a one-note pour. It's a multi-cru, multi-vintage blend that layers different grapes and reserve wines like a mosaic. In the glass, you're tasting roughly 45% of Pinot Noir for structure and quiet power, 40% of Chardonnay for finesse and citrus brightness, and about 15% of Meunier to soften the edges with fruit and roundness. On the nose, it greets you with a delicate lift of lemon zest and green apple, softened by white blossoms and just a whisper of brioche. On the palate, bright citrus and orchard fruit unfold over chalky mineral spine, polished yet vibrant, with a subtle creaminess from extended lees aging that smooths every edge without dimming its energy. Let's talk score. Grape composition. Henriot is a very deliberate and polished blend with a high percentage of reserve wines and partial MLF, which is textbook craftsmanship. Where it loses a couple of points is not in quality but in ambition. It's designed as a flagship non-vintage, so it plays within the house style rather than pushing extremes. It isn't a single vintage, single village statement or an experimental zero-dosage bottling. It's the sovereign standard that naturally makes it less layered or wow tasting profile. It's beautiful in the glass, bright citrus, orchard fruit, chalky spine, refined mousse, but the style is elegant and consistent rather than kaleidoscopic. You don't get deep brioche, roasted nuts, or Chardonnay notes you find in the bottles that have spent 6 to 8 years on the lees. In other words, it's poised and graceful, but not a roller coaster of evolving aromas and textures. History and legacy. This category is actually Henriot's strength. Widow-founded, imperial warrant, 2 centuries of independent vision. It's one of the oldest houses still in family hands. The only reason it's not a straight 100 is purely brand recognition. Outside Champagne circles, Henriot doesn't carry the instant global cachet like Veuve or Bollinger, even though the story is just as rich. Price versus quality. At $56, you are getting Premier and Grand Cru sourcing and extended lease aging. That's an exceptionally good value. The house stays deliberately accessible. A prestige cuvée from Henriot, Cuvée Émera, would feel like a 100-point value bomb, but Souverain is more like a quiet luxury, everyday celebration. Fights in its weight class. Among non-vintage champagnes at this tier, like Veuve, Piper, or Laurent-Perrier, even some grower bottles, Henriot holds its ground with a quiet confidence. Yes, it might be less toasty than Bollinger, less lazy citrus than Laurent-Perrier, but it shows a quietly balanced style with marked Chardonnay presence and gives it finesse and lift. I give it a 94. Hey, 94 is a serious score, and Henriot Brut Souverain earns every point with its refined blend, patient lease aging, and 2 centuries of quiet craft. The only thing keeping it from perfect 100 is intentional. It's built to be the house's benchmark of consistency and finesse, not a boundary-breaking, once-in-a-lifetime unicorn. And that's the point. Henriot isn't here to reinvent champagne. He's the friend who always shows up with a good bottle and the better playlist. Reliable can still sparkle. And that's a wrap. For today's episode anyway. I'm Julia, and this was Sip Me Maybe, the podcast where every glass has a story and no sip goes unnoticed. Until the next time, keep your glasses half full, and I'll see you in the next pour.